Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Martinez gripped the cyclic stick of her MH-60 Black Hawk as the helicopter cut through the pre-dawn darkness over the mountains of Afghanistan. The rhythmic thump of the rotor blades above her head was a familiar comfort, a mechanical heartbeat that had carried her safely through dozens of missions in her 3 years as a Navy pilot. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of her dual identity pressed heavier on her shoulders than usual. Few people knew that Sarah Martinez was more than just a skilled helicopter pilot. Fewer still knew that she had completed the grueling Navy SEAL training program, becoming one of only a handful of women to earn the coveted Trident pin. The military brass had decided her unique combination of skills made her perfect for the most sensitive operations, where both aviation expertise and special operations training were required. She was a ghost within the system, officially listed as a pilot but secretly deployed as both aviator and operator when missions demanded it. The radio crackled in her headset as the mission commander's voice cut through the static. "Phoenix, we're approaching the LZ. Weather report shows heavy cloud cover moving in from the west. Window for extraction is getting smaller." Sarah adjusted her night vision goggles and peered through the cockpit glass. Below them, the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their snow-covered summits glowing pale green in her enhanced vision. Somewhere in those treacherous valleys, a team of American intelligence operatives had been gathering crucial information about a high-value target when their position was compromised. Now they were trapped, surrounded by hostile forces, with their only hope of survival flying through the darkness at 150 miles per hour. "Copy that, Control. Phoenix has visual on the LZ. Beginning approach in 30 seconds. Sarah's voice was steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had done this dance before, but each time carried its own unique dangers. The landing zone was nothing more than a small clearing on a mountainside, barely large enough for the helicopter's rotor disc. One miscalculation, one gust of wind, and the entire mission could end in disaster. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Jake "Wizard" Thompson, worked methodically through his pre-landing checklist. Jake had been flying with Sarah for 8 months, and while he knew she was exceptional, he had no idea about her SEAL background. As far as he knew, she was simply the best pilot he had ever flown with, possessing an almost supernatural ability to handle the aircraft in impossible conditions. 30 seconds out, Jake announced, his eyes scanning the instrument panel. "All systems green. Fuel looking good for extraction and return to base." Sarah nodded, her attention focused entirely on the approach. The helicopter descended through the thin mountain air, every control input requiring precise calculation. At this altitude, the air was so thin that the rotor blades had less to bite into, making the aircraft sluggish and unpredictable. Add in the possibility of enemy fire, and the margin for error became razor thin. As they dropped below the ridgeline, Sarah's trained eyes swept the surrounding terrain. Her SEAL training had taught her to think like the enemy, to identify potential ambush sites and escape routes. What she saw made her blood run cold. The landing zone was perfect for their needs, but it was also a natural kill zone. High ground surrounded them on 3 sides, offering multiple positions for enemy fighters to engage them during the vulnerable moments of landing and takeoff. "Control, Phoenix. I'm seeing multiple potential firing positions around the LZ. Recommend we abort and find an alternative site." Sarah's voice carried a note of urgency that made Jake look at her sharply. Pilots were trained to assess tactical situations, but Sarah's analysis was more detailed and precise than anything he had heard before. The mission commander's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Negative, Phoenix. Intelligence team is under heavy pressure. Multiple casualties reported. You are cleared hot for immediate landing. Ground forces will provide suppressive fire during approach." Sarah felt the familiar weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders. The intelligence team needed immediate evacuation, but landing in an obvious ambush site violated every principle of tactical aviation she had ever learned. However, abandoning fellow Americans was not an option. She had taken an oath to leave no one behind, and that oath applied whether she was wearing pilot's wings or a SEAL Trident. "Copy, Control. Phoenix is going in." She pushed the cyclic forward, and began the final approach, her hands moving with practiced precision across the controls. Below them, muzzle flashes began to appear from the tree line as American forces engaged enemy positions. The night exploded in a deadly light show of tracer rounds and explosions. Jake's voice was tight with concentration as he called out their altitude and distance. 100 feet, 50 meters out. Looking good, Sarah. These guys are really counting on us. The helicopter touched down with barely a shudder, Sarah's skill evident in the smooth landing despite the challenging conditions. The moment the skids hit the ground, the cabin door slid open and the crew chief began helping wounded intelligence operatives aboard. Sarah kept the engines spooled up, ready for immediate takeoff, while her eyes continuously scanned the surrounding ridgelines. That's when she saw the flash. Years of SEAL training had honed her instincts to a razor's edge, and she recognized the distinctive signature of a rocket-propelled grenade launch immediately. The projectile streaked through the darkness like a malevolent star, its path aimed directly at their aircraft. RPG. Brake right. Sarah's warning came too late. The grenade struck the helicopter's tail rotor assembly with devastating effect, sending shrapnel throughout the aircraft and instantly destroying their ability to control the aircraft's rotation. The Black Hawk spun violently to the left, the massive torque of the main rotor no longer balanced by the tail rotor's thrust. Jake was thrown against his restraint system as the helicopter began to spin out of control. We're hit. We're hit. Tail rotor's gone. His training took over as he began the emergency shutdown procedures. But Sarah was already ahead of him, her hands flying across the controls as she fought to maintain some semblance of control. Mayday, Mayday, Phoenix is going down. Tail rotor destroyed, losing control. Sarah's voice was calm despite the chaos around her. The helicopter was descending rapidly, spinning like a leaf in a tornado. Through her night vision goggles, she could see the ground rushing up to meet them with terrifying speed. In those final seconds before impact, Sarah's SEAL training took over completely. While Jake focused on the emergency procedures, she was already planning for what came after the crash. Her eyes identified potential defensive positions, escape routes, and the locations of enemy forces. When they hit the ground, the real fight would begin, and she would need every advantage she could get. The crash came with the sound of tearing metal and splintering glass. The helicopter hit the rocky slope sideways, the impact throwing everyone inside against the cabin walls. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her left shoulder as she was thrown against the door frame. But she remained conscious and alert. The aircraft slid down the slope for nearly 50 yards before coming to rest against a large boulder, the fuselage crumpled but intact enough to provide some protection. Silence fell over the crash site, broken only by the settling sounds of twisted metal and the distant crack of gunfire. Sarah quickly assessed her condition and found that while bruised and bleeding, she was still operational. Jake was unconscious but breathing, a large gash across his forehead bleeding freely. In the cabin behind them, she could hear moans and cries from the wounded intelligence operatives they had been trying to rescue. Phoenix, Phoenix, come in. What's your status? The radio was somehow still functional, the mission commander's voice cutting through the static with desperate urgency. Sarah keyed the microphone with her good arm. Phoenix is down but operational. Multiple casualties on board. We need immediate extraction and medical support. Even as she spoke, she was mentally cataloging their tactical situation. They were stranded in enemy territory with wounded personnel and limited weapons. The crashed helicopter would act as a beacon for every hostile fighter in the area. Copy, Phoenix. QRF is 20 minutes out. Hold your position and defend until extraction arrives. 20 minutes. Sarah almost laughed at the impossibility of it. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours given their situation. But as she reached for her service pistol and checked its magazine, she felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was what she had trained for during those brutal months in SEAL training. This was why she had pushed herself beyond every limit, why she had endured every humiliation and challenge. She was exactly where she needed to be. Moving carefully through the wreckage, Sarah began checking on the other survivors. Jake was starting to regain consciousness, his hand moving to his head with a groan of pain. What happened? Where are we? We crashed, Jake. Tail rotor took an RPG hit. Help is coming, but we need to hold this position until they arrive. Sarah's voice was steady and confident, and she saw some of the panic leave Jake's eyes as he focused on her words. Behind them, 3 of the 4 intelligence operatives were still alive, though 2 were seriously wounded. The team leader, a grizzled CIA operative named Marcus Chun, had taken shrapnel in his leg but was still functional. He looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen too much combat in too many forgotten corners of the world. You military pilot? Because if you are, you need to know we're in serious trouble here. My team was compromised because someone leaked our position. There are at least 30 fighters converging on this location, and they know exactly where we are. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I'm Navy, and yes, I know we're in trouble, but we're not dead yet, and as long as we're breathing, we fight. Something in her tone made Chun take a closer look at her. Most pilots, even combat veterans, didn't speak with that particular brand of quiet confidence when facing impossible odds. The first enemy fighters appeared at the edge of the clearing 15 minutes after the crash. Sarah had used the time well, positioning the survivors in a defensive perimeter using the helicopter's wreckage as cover. She had distributed weapons and ammunition from the aircraft's emergency stores, and had given each person specific fields of fire and responsibilities. Jake, despite his head injury, was proving to be a capable fighter. His service pistol barked repeatedly as enemy muzzle flashes appeared in the tree line, and Sarah was impressed by his accuracy under pressure. The intelligence operatives were also holding their own, their CIA training evident in their disciplined fire control and tactical awareness. But Sarah knew they were heavily outnumbered and running low on ammunition. The enemy fighters were professional and patient, content to surround the crash site and wait for reinforcements before launching a final assault. They had all night, while Sarah and her team had perhaps minutes before their defensive position was overrun. That's when she made the decision that would change everything. Chun, I need you to take charge of the defensive perimeter. Keep everyone's heads down and conserve ammunition. Only shoot at targets you can hit. Sarah was already moving as she spoke, checking her gear and preparing for what came next. Where are you going? Jake's voice carried a note of panic. You can't leave us here. Sarah looked back at him with a slight smile. I'm not leaving. I'm just evening the odds a little. Before anyone could stop her, she slipped over the side of the helicopter wreckage and disappeared into the darkness. What the enemy fighters didn't know was that they weren't just dealing with a crashed helicopter crew anymore. They were dealing with a Navy SEAL who had been trained to operate alone behind enemy lines, and who had just been given the perfect opportunity to use those skills. Sarah moved through the darkness like a ghost, her SEAL training allowing her to navigate the rocky terrain without making a sound. She had memorized the positions of the enemy fighters during the initial exchange of gunfire, and now she began to hunt them with methodical precision. The first fighter never saw her coming. Sarah approached from behind, moving through a drainage ditch that provided concealment from the main force. Her combat knife found its target silently, and one threat was eliminated without alerting the others. She appropriated his AK-47 rifle and ammunition, significantly upgrading her firepower. The second fighter was more challenging, positioned on high ground with good visibility in all directions. Sarah spent precious minutes finding an approach route that would keep her hidden, finally reaching a position where she could engage him with the captured rifle. The shots echoed across the valley, but by the time his comrades identified the source of the fire, Sarah was already moving to her next target. For the next hour, she conducted a one-woman campaign of terror against the enemy force. Using every technique she had learned in SEAL training, she struck without warning and disappeared before retaliation could be organized. She used the terrain to her advantage, setting up ambushes and then melting away into the darkness when the enemy responded. Back at the helicopter, Jake and the others listened to the sounds of gunfire moving around their perimeter with growing amazement. Whoever was out there was systematically dismantling the enemy force that had them surrounded. Chun, with his years of experience in covert operations, began to suspect that their pilot was more than she appeared to be. Jake, what do you know about your pilot? What's her background? Chen's question was urgent, his tactical mind putting together pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit the picture of a normal Navy aviator. Jake shook his head, wincing at the movement. Sarah's the best pilot I've ever flown with, but I don't know much about her background. She's quiet, keeps to herself mostly, but she seems to know things about tactics and combat that most pilots don't. Chen nodded slowly. He had worked with enough special operations personnel to recognize the signs. The way she had organized their defense, her calm under pressure, and now this solo campaign against superior numbers all pointed to training that went far beyond normal flight school. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Phoenix, this is Anvil 6. QRF is 5 minutes out. What's your status? Jake keyed the microphone, looking around the crash site uncertainly. Anvil 6, Phoenix is complicated. Our pilot is currently engaged in solo operations against enemy forces. We're holding our position, but ammunition is low. There was a pause before the response came. Phoenix, clarify. Did you say solo operations? Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. The quick reaction force was arriving, their aircraft's powerful searchlights cutting through the darkness as they swept the area for threats. What they found was a scene that would become legend in special operations circles. Around the crash site, the bodies of enemy fighters were scattered across the mountainside, each positioned in a way that showed they had been engaged by someone with professional military training. The surviving enemy forces had withdrawn to positions much further from the helicopter, clearly having learned to respect the lethal presence that had been stalking them through the night. 3 months after the mountain rescue, Sarah Martinez sat in a sterile conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. The walls were lined with photographs of distinguished SEAL operators, their faces telling stories of courage and sacrifice that had shaped American military history. Across the polished table from her sat Commander Patricia "Ice" Morrison, one of the most decorated female officers in naval special warfare, and Captain James "Hawk" Rodriguez, whose reputation in the special operations community was legendary. The debriefing from Afghanistan had raised questions that went far beyond a simple combat search and rescue mission. Sarah's performance during the helicopter crash had demonstrated capabilities that suggested her potential was being underutilized in her current role as a pilot. More importantly, her dual qualifications as both a pilot and a SEAL operator had caught the attention of planners working on a new type of mission profile. Lieutenant Martinez, Commander Morrison began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had broken barriers throughout her career. Your actions in Afghanistan were exemplary. But they also revealed something we need to address. You've been operating in a gray area between your official duties as a pilot and your SEAL qualifications. It's time we brought that into the light. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the table. Sarah, we've been developing a new operational concept, something that requires your unique combination of skills. But before we go any further, I need to know if you're willing to step fully into the SEAL role. What happened in Afghanistan was exceptional, but what we're proposing would make that your primary mission profile. Sarah had known this moment would come eventually. Since earning her Trident pin, she had been caught between two worlds, officially a pilot but secretly trained for operations that required her to be much more. The crash in Afghanistan had forced her to reveal capabilities she had kept hidden, and now the military wanted to make use of those skills on a larger scale. Sir, what exactly are you proposing? Sarah's question was direct, but she already suspected what was coming. The military had invested too much in her training to let her remain in a traditional pilot role indefinitely. Morrison slid a classified folder across the table. Operation Deep Strike. It's a new initiative designed to address threats that require both aviation assets and direct action capabilities. We're forming small teams of dual-qualified operators who can insert themselves into hostile territory, conduct special operations missions, and extract themselves without requiring additional aviation support. Sarah opened the folder and began reading. The concept was ambitious and dangerous. Teams of 4 to 6 operators, all qualified as both pilots and SEALs, would deploy to remote locations worldwide to conduct missions that were too sensitive or too risky for conventional special operations forces. They would operate with minimal support, using their aviation skills to get in and out of areas that were otherwise inaccessible. The first mission is already being planned, Rodriguez continued. We've identified a high-value target in the mountains of Pakistan, a terrorist financier who's been funding operations against American interests for years. Intelligence suggests he's holed up in a compound that's virtually impossible to reach through conventional means. Too remote for a standard SEAL insertion, too well defended for a direct assault. Sarah studied the mission brief with growing interest. The target was located in a valley surrounded by peaks that rose over 15,000 feet, accessible only by helicopter but defended by surface-to-air missiles that made a conventional air assault suicidal. The compound itself was built into the side of a mountain, with natural barriers that would make a ground approach nearly impossible. You want us to insert on foot and approach the target overland, Sarah said, her tactical mind already working through the challenges. But how do we get close enough to begin the infiltration? The nearest suitable landing zone is 40 miles away, through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Morrison smiled for the first time during the meeting. That's where your SEAL training comes in. You and your team would deploy from high altitude, using halo insertion to land within striking distance of the target. Then, you'd conduct a multi-day infiltration through the mountains, eliminate the target, and extract to a predetermined pickup point. The plan was audacious, but Sarah could see the logic behind it. A small team of highly trained operators would be able to move through terrain that would stop a larger force, and their aviation backgrounds would allow them to coordinate their own extraction with precision that ground-based operators might not possess. Who else is being considered for the team? Sarah asked, already mentally preparing herself for the challenges ahead. Rodriguez consulted his notes. We're looking at Lieutenant Commander Marcus Frost Williams, a former helicopter pilot who went through SEAL training 2 years ago. Petty Officer First Class David Tank Johnson, an explosives expert who earned his wings after completing SEAL training. And Lieutenant Brian Ghost Patterson, a communications specialist with both pilot and SEAL qualifications. Sarah recognized the names from her time in the special operations community. Williams was known for his cool head under pressure and his ability to fly in conditions that would ground most pilots. Johnson was a demolitions expert whose precision with explosives was legendary, and Patterson was one of the best communications specialists in the Navy. Together, they would form a team with complementary skills and the ability to operate independently in hostile territory. When do we start training? Sarah's question indicated her acceptance of the mission before she formally agreed to it. Morrison and Rodriguez exchanged glances. Training begins next week. But, Sarah, I want you to understand what you're signing up for. This isn't just another mission. If Deep Strike is successful, it could change the way special operations are conducted. You'd be pioneers in a new type of warfare, but that also means you'd be taking risks that no one has taken before. Sarah thought about the helicopter crash in Afghanistan, about the moment when she had made the decision to leave the safety of the wreckage and hunt the enemy through the darkness. That night, she had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known before. She wasn't content to be just a pilot or just a SEAL. She wanted to be something more, something that could make a difference in ways that conventional forces couldn't. I understand the risks, ma'am, and I'm ready to take them. The training compound at Naval Special Warfare Command became Sarah's home for the next 6 weeks. The Deep Strike program demanded skills that went beyond either pilot training or SEAL qualification. Team members had to master high-altitude insertion techniques, mountain warfare tactics, long-range communications, and advanced battlefield medicine. They also had to learn to work together as a unit that could function independently for extended periods. Sarah's first meeting with her new teammates took place in a nondescript building that housed some of the Navy's most classified training programs. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Williams was exactly what she had expected, a tall, lean man with the quiet confidence that came from years of flying dangerous missions. His handshake was firm, and his eyes held the same calculating intelligence she had seen in other successful special operations officers. Petty Officer David Johnson was built like a linebacker, with massive shoulders and hands that looked capable of crushing steel. But when he spoke about explosives and demolition techniques, his voice carried the precision of a scientist discussing a delicate experiment. Sarah quickly realized that behind his imposing physical presence was one of the sharpest tactical minds she had ever encountered. Lieutenant Brian Patterson was the surprise of the group. Slightly built and soft-spoken, he looked more like a college professor than a special operations warrior. But when he began explaining the communication systems they would be using, his expertise became obvious. He could maintain contact with command elements from anywhere in the world using equipment that weighed less than a standard military radio. Their first training exercise took place in the mountains of Colorado, where conditions approximated what they would face in Pakistan. The team conducted a halo insertion from 25,000 feet, landing in a snowfield 15 miles from their target. They then had to navigate through rough terrain while avoiding simulated enemy patrols, establish a surveillance position, and plan an assault on a mock compound. Sarah found herself adapting quickly to the role of team leader, though the position had never been officially assigned. Her combination of tactical experience and aviation background made her the natural choice for coordinating their movements and planning their extraction. Williams and Johnson deferred to her judgment on tactical matters, while Patterson ensured they maintained communication with their support elements. The exercise revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their approach. The team moved well together, with each member contributing specialized skills that enhanced their overall capability. Sarah's ability to read terrain from an aviator's perspective proved invaluable in planning routes that would avoid detection, while Johnson's expertise with explosives allowed them to create diversions that masked their true approach. However, the physical demands of operating at high altitude while carrying heavy equipment pushed all of them to their limits. Even with their exceptional conditioning, the combination of thin air, cold weather, and rough terrain made every mile a struggle. They completed the exercise successfully, but it was clear that their margin for error on an actual mission would be razor-thin. Their second exercise took place in the Nevada desert, where they practiced urban assault techniques against a mock compound similar to their actual target in Pakistan. This time, they inserted by helicopter at night, conducted a 10-mile approach march through hostile territory, and assaulted the target before extracting to a predetermined pickup point. The exercise went flawlessly, with each team member performing their assigned role with precision. Sarah led the assault team through the compound's defenses, while Johnson eliminated key structural targets with surgical precision. Williams provided overwatch from a sniper position, and Patterson maintained communications with extraction assets while coordinating the team's movements. But it was during the debriefing that Sarah learned something that would change her perspective on the entire mission. Lieutenant Martinez, the exercise controller, said as he reviewed their performance, "Your team's execution was nearly perfect. But I want you to consider something. In a real-world scenario, you might not have the luxury of a clean extraction. What would you do if your helicopter support was compromised?" The question struck Sarah like a physical blow. Throughout their training, she had assumed that their aviation support would be reliable and available when needed. But the controller was right to raise the possibility that they might find themselves stranded in hostile territory with no way out except their own skills and determination. "We'd adapt, sir. Find alternative extraction methods, or make our way to friendly territory on foot." Sarah's answer was automatic, but privately she began to consider the implications of being trapped behind enemy lines with no support. "That's exactly what happened to a special operations team in Somalia 15 years ago," the controller continued. "They completed their mission successfully, but found themselves cut off from extraction for 3 days. Only one member of the team made it home." That night, Sarah lay awake in her quarters thinking about the controller's words. She had always known that special operations carried significant risks, but the possibility of being abandoned behind enemy lines with no hope of rescue was something she hadn't fully considered. Yet as she thought about it, she realized that the risk was part of what drew her to this type of work. The challenge of operating independently, of relying only on her own skills and those of her teammates, was exactly what she had been looking for throughout her military career. The final training exercise took place at a classified facility in the mountains of Montana, where the team faced their most challenging scenario yet. They were required to conduct a halo insertion in bad weather, navigate 15 miles of mountainous terrain while evading enemy forces, assault a fortified position, and extract on foot to a pickup point 30 miles away. The insertion went wrong almost immediately. High winds during the parachute descent scattered the team across a wider area than planned, and Patterson landed hard, injuring his ankle. Sarah found herself 2 miles from the planned landing zone with a teammate who could barely walk and enemy forces closing in on their position. But instead of aborting the mission, Sarah made the decision that would define her leadership style for years to come. She redistributed Patterson's equipment among the team members, improvised a field splint for his ankle, and modified their approach route to accommodate his limited mobility. Rather than seeing his injury as a liability, she used it as an opportunity to test their ability to adapt under pressure. The team reached their target 18 hours behind schedule, but still within the mission window. Johnson's explosive expertise allowed them to breach the compound's defenses quietly, while Williams provided precision fire support that eliminated the defenders without raising an alarm. Sarah led the assault team through the building with methodical efficiency, securing the target and gathering intelligence materials before beginning their extraction. The 30-mile journey to the pickup point tested every skill they had learned. Patterson's injury slowed their progress, but his determination to keep up with the team impressed everyone. They moved through terrain that would have challenged healthy troops, carrying wounded teammate and mission-essential equipment while avoiding enemy patrols that were hunting for them. They reached the extraction point with less than an hour to spare, exhausted but successful. As the helicopter lifted them away from the mountains, Sarah looked at her teammates and realized they had become something more than just a military unit. They were a family, bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. The debriefing was conducted by senior officers who had been monitoring their progress throughout the exercise. Sarah was surprised to see Admiral Rebecca Storm Watson, the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command, among the observers. Admiral Watson was a legend in the special operations community, one of the first women to achieve flag rank in naval special warfare. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Watson began, "what you've accomplished over the past 6 weeks represents a new capability for American special operations. You've proven that small teams of dual-qualified operators can conduct missions that were previously considered impossible. Your performance has exceeded our highest expectations." Sarah felt a surge of pride at the Admiral's words, but she also sensed that more was coming. Admiral Watson's expression suggested that their training was about to transition from exercises to real-world operations. "Your first operational deployment will begin in 72 hours, Admiral Watson continued. "The target in Pakistan that you've been training for has been confirmed active and represents an immediate threat to American interests. Intelligence suggests he's planning a major operation that could result in significant casualties if allowed to proceed." The room fell silent as the weight of their responsibility settled on the team members. Everything they had trained for was about to be put to the test in the most unforgiving environment possible. "Sarah," Admiral Watson said, addressing her directly, "you'll be the team leader for this operation. The success or failure of Deep Strike as a concept rests largely on your shoulders. Are you ready for that responsibility?" Sarah looked at her teammates, seeing the same mixture of anticipation and determination in their eyes that she felt in her own heart. They had trained for this moment, prepared for every challenge they might face. But she also knew that real combat had a way of presenting problems that no amount of training could fully prepare you for. "Yes, ma'am. We're ready." Admiral Watson nodded slowly. "Then, God help you, because once you're inserted into Pakistan, you'll be entirely on your own. There will be no cavalry coming to rescue you if things go wrong. Your success depends entirely on your training, your skills, and your ability to work together as a team." As the briefing ended and the team members dispersed to begin their mission preparations, Sarah remained behind to speak with Admiral Watson privately. "Admiral, I want you to know that we understand the risks. But I also want you to see the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz cut through the dark waters of the Arabian Sea like a floating city of steel and determination." In the depths of the ship's classified briefing rooms, Sarah Martinez and her Deep Strike team conducted their final mission preparations surrounded by intelligence photos, satellite imagery, and tactical maps that painted a picture of one of the most challenging operations ever attempted by American Special Forces. The target, Hassan al-Malik, had been on the CIA's most wanted list for nearly a decade. The terrorist financier had funneled millions of dollars to organizations responsible for attacks across the Middle East and Europe, but his location in the remote mountains of Pakistan had made him virtually untouchable. His compound, built into the side of a mountain at an elevation of 12,000 feet, was protected by natural barriers that made conventional assault impossible and defended by surface-to-air missiles that could destroy any helicopter attempting a direct approach. Latest intelligence confirms al-Malik is still in the compound. CIA operative Jennifer Raven Cross briefed the team. She was a veteran of covert operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan, with contacts throughout the region that provided crucial information for missions like this one. However, there's been increased radio traffic in the area over the past 48 hours. Something has them stirred up, but we don't know what. Sarah studied the aerial photographs with the trained eye of both a pilot and a special operations planner. The compound was a fortress in the truest sense, with multiple defensive positions carved into the mountainside and a commanding view of all possible approach routes. The single road that led to the facility was heavily guarded and mined, while the surrounding peaks offered no suitable landing zones for helicopters. What about local forces? Lieutenant Commander Williams asked, his voice carrying the concern of someone who had seen too many missions compromised by unexpected enemy reinforcements. Cross consulted her notes. Pakistani military has a small outpost about 20 miles south of the target, but they're not expected to interfere. However, there are reports of increased Taliban activity in the region. They may be planning their own operation against al-Malik. The possibility of encountering Taliban forces added another layer of complexity to an already difficult mission. While the terrorist organization might be considered an enemy of al-Malik, they would certainly view any American special operations team as a target of opportunity. Sarah and her team could find themselves fighting a two-front war in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Petty Officer Johnson spread out detailed floor plans of the compound, intelligence gathered by CIA assets who had penetrated al-Malik's security network at considerable personal risk. The target spends most of his time in this central building, he said, pointing to a structure built into a natural cave system. 3 levels, with his personal quarters on the lowest level. Multiple escape routes lead deeper into the mountain. Sarah traced the routes with her finger, her tactical mind already working through the challenges of clearing a 3-dimensional target while preventing the primary objective from escaping into tunnel systems that could extend for miles. It would require precise timing and coordination that left no room for error. Extraction remains our biggest challenge, Lieutenant Patterson added, his communications expertise making him acutely aware of the difficulties they would face once the assault began. Once we initiate the attack, every hostile force within 50 miles will know our location. The nearest safe extraction point is 40 miles away through terrain that's completely controlled by enemy forces. Admiral Watson, who had arrived on the Nimitz specifically to oversee the mission launch, leaned forward in her chair. That's why this mission is so important beyond just eliminating al-Malik. If Deep Strike succeeds here, it proves that small teams of dual-qualified operators can conduct operations in areas where conventional forces can't go. If it fails, she didn't need to complete the sentence. Everyone in the room understood that failure would mean not just the loss of the team, but the end of a concept that could revolutionize special operations warfare. The pressure was immense, but Sarah had learned during her SEAL training that pressure either crushed you or turned you into something harder than you had been before. The insertion would take place at 0200 hours, with the team jumping from a specially modified C-130 aircraft at 28,000 feet. The high-altitude, low-opening parachute technique would allow them to glide nearly 30 miles from the drop point to their landing zone, far enough to avoid detection by enemy radar systems, but close enough to reach the target within the mission timeline. Sarah and her team spent the final hours before launch checking and rechecking their equipment. Each member carried nearly 80 pounds of gear, including weapons, ammunition, explosives, communications equipment, and survival supplies that would sustain them during the multi-day operation. Every piece of equipment had been selected for maximum capability and minimum weight, but the load was still enormous by conventional standards. Remember, Sarah addressed her team as they completed their equipment checks. Once we're on the ground, we're completely on our own. No cavalry is coming if we get into trouble. We succeed or fail based on our training, our skills, and our ability to work together. Williams nodded, his weathered face showing the calm determination that had carried him through dozens of dangerous missions. We've trained for this. We know what we're doing. Johnson finished checking his demolition charges, each one precisely calculated to achieve maximum effect while minimizing collateral damage. Just get me to those defensive positions. I'll make sure they can't use them against us or anyone else. Patterson tested his communications systems one final time, confirming that he could maintain contact with extraction assets despite the challenging terrain and distance involved. Comms are solid. I'll be able to coordinate our extraction from anywhere within 50 miles of the target. The C-130 transport aircraft lifted off from the Nimitz precisely on schedule, its 4 turboprop engines carrying the deep strike team toward a rendezvous with danger that would test every skill they had learned. Sarah sat in the aircraft's cargo bay, surrounded by her teammates and equipment, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and fear that preceded every high-risk operation. The flight to the drop zone took 3 hours, the aircraft climbing steadily to reach the altitude required for their insertion. As they approached Pakistani airspace, the pilot activated the plane's stealth systems and began flying a route designed to avoid radar detection. Sarah and her team began the final preparations for their jump, checking parachutes and equipment connections with the methodical precision that could mean the difference between life and death. 10 minutes to drop zone, the loadmaster announced. Sarah and her team moved to the aircraft's rear door, where they would exit into the thin air of the stratosphere. The temperature outside was nearly 60 degrees below zero, and they wore special suits designed to protect them during the long descent to their landing zone. Sarah looked at each of her teammates one final time, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. They had trained for this moment for months, but training could only prepare you for so much. Real combat had a way of presenting challenges that no simulation could replicate. 2 minutes. The loadmaster's voice cut through the noise of the aircraft's engines. Sarah moved to the door position, her teammates forming up behind her in the formation they had practiced dozens of times. Below them, the mountains of Pakistan stretched endlessly in all directions, their snow-covered peaks glowing pale in the moonlight. Go, go, go. The signal came, and Sarah threw herself into the darkness, her teammates following close behind. The initial shock of the thin air was overwhelming, but her training took over as she stabilized her position and began the long glide toward their landing zone. Through her night vision goggles, she could see the other team members spread out around her in the formation they had practiced. The descent took nearly 20 minutes, the team members using their parachute's steering capabilities to navigate toward a small valley 15 miles from their target. Sarah monitored their progress using a GPS device strapped to her wrist, making minor corrections to ensure they would land within the designated area. The landing was harder than she had expected, the rocky ground and thin air making for a jarring impact even with her advanced parachute system. Sarah rolled to absorb the shock, then quickly gathered her parachute and began searching for her teammates. Within minutes, all 4 team members had landed safely and were consolidating their equipment. Sound off, Sarah whispered into her radio, keeping her voice low to avoid detection by any enemy forces that might be in the area. Frost, operational, Williams reported. Tank, good to go, Johnson confirmed. Ghost, systems up, Patterson added. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The insertion had gone perfectly, placing them exactly where they needed to be with all equipment and personnel intact. But she also knew that the easy part was over. Now they had to navigate 15 miles of hostile territory in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, all while avoiding detection by enemy forces that were actively hunting for intruders. The team moved out immediately, following a route that Sarah had memorized from satellite imagery and topographical maps. They traveled in single file, with Williams taking point, followed by Johnson and Patterson, while Sarah brought up the rear where she could observe the entire team and watch for pursuing forces. The terrain was everything the intelligence reports had warned them about. Steep rocky slopes covered with loose shale made every step treacherous, while the thin air at 12,000 feet elevation left all of them struggling for breath despite their excellent conditioning. They made barely 2 miles during their first hour of movement, far slower than their mission timeline required. "Phoenix, we need to pick up the pace," Williams radioed. "At this rate, we won't reach the target until after dawn." Sarah checked her watch and realized he was right. They had planned for challenging terrain, but the reality was worse than anything they had experienced during training. However, moving faster meant accepting greater risk of injury or detection, either of which could compromise the entire mission. "Copy, Frost. Let's try the ridge route. It's more exposed, but the footing should be better." The decision to take the ridge route nearly proved fatal. As the team climbed toward the higher ground, they walked directly into a Taliban patrol that was conducting its own reconnaissance of the area. The enemy fighters were as surprised as the Americans, but they recovered quickly and opened fire with automatic weapons. Sarah's SEAL training took over immediately. She identified the enemy positions, coordinated her team's response, and began maneuvering to gain tactical advantage. But fighting at high altitude while carrying heavy equipment was exhausting, and she could see that her teammates were struggling with the physical demands. "Tank, can you get us some room to maneuver?" Sarah called out as bullets whined overhead. Johnson's response was immediate and devastating. He lobbed a fragmentation grenade into the center of the enemy position, the explosion echoing across the valley like thunder. The Taliban fighters who survived the blast scattered, giving the American team the opportunity they needed to break contact and continue their mission. But the firefight had cost them precious time and alerted every hostile force in the area to their presence. Sarah knew that by morning, the entire region would be swarming with enemy fighters searching for them. Their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The team pushed forward through the remainder of the night, driven by the knowledge that failure was not an option. They reached the final approach to Al-Malik's compound just as the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn. Sarah called a halt in a defensive position that offered good observation of their target while providing concealment from enemy forces. Through her binoculars, Sarah studied the compound that had been their objective for months of training and planning. The intelligence reports had been accurate in their description of the fortifications, but seeing them firsthand made the challenge seem even more daunting. The compound was built into the mountainside like a medieval fortress, with multiple levels of defensive positions and commanding views of all possible approach routes. "Jesus," Williams breathed as he looked through his own binoculars. "How are we supposed to get through all that?" Sarah was asking herself the same question. The compound's defenses had been designed by someone who understood both modern warfare and the natural advantages provided by the terrain. Getting inside would require every skill they possessed, and probably some luck as well. But as she studied the target, Sarah began to notice patterns in the guards' movements and weaknesses in the defensive positions that could be exploited. The compound's strength was also its weakness. The defenders were so confident in their natural barriers that they had become complacent about certain approaches. "I've got an idea," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that her teammates had learned to trust. "But it's going to require precision timing and some creative use of Johnson's explosives." For the next hour, Sarah outlined a plan that was audacious even by special operations standards. They would approach the compound from the most unlikely direction, using demolitions to create their own entry point, while simultaneously eliminating the defensive positions that could interfere with their assault. Johnson studied the plan with the eye of an expert, calculating explosive yields and blast effects with mathematical precision. "It's risky, but it could work. I'll need to get within 50 meters of those positions to place the charges accurately." Williams nodded slowly, his sniper's eye already identifying the positions where he could provide overwatch during the assault. "I can cover your approach and take out any guards that spot you before you're ready." Patterson checked his equipment, ensuring that he would be able to coordinate the assault on Hassan al-Malik's mountain fortress began at 0630 hours, with the precision timing that had become the hallmark of Sarah's leadership. She had positioned her team in a semicircle around the compound's weakest approach, a narrow ravine that the defenders had dismissed as impassable. What they hadn't counted on was a team of Navy SEALs willing to rappel down a near-vertical cliff face in order to gain tactical advantage. Sarah went first, her ropes secured to an outcropping of rock 50 feet above the compound's outer perimeter. The descent was treacherous, with loose rock threatening to give way under her weight and expose her to enemy fire. But her climbing training from SEAL school served her well, and she reached the bottom of the ravine without detection. Williams followed, his sniper rifle and equipment adding bulk that made the descent even more challenging. Johnson came next, carrying the demolition charges that would be crucial to their assault plan. Patterson brought up the rear, his communications equipment carefully protected in a reinforced case that could withstand the impacts of the dangerous descent. From their position in the ravine, Sarah could see the compound's defensive positions with startling clarity. The intelligence reports had been accurate, but they hadn't conveyed the psychological impact of seeing the fortress from ground level. The structure seemed to grow out of the mountainside itself, its stone walls blending seamlessly with the natural rock formations. Phase 1, Sarah whispered into her radio. "Tank, you're up." Johnson began his approach to the compound's outer defensive wall, moving through the ravine with the stealth that had made him one of the Navy's premier special operations warriors. His target was a guard tower that commanded the approach route they would need to use during their assault. Eliminating it would create a blind spot in the compound's defenses that they could exploit. The placement of the demolition charges required Johnson to climb the exterior wall of the guard tower, a feat that would have been impossible for anyone without extensive mountaineering experience. But Johnson's training had prepared him for exactly this type of challenge. He moved up the wall like a spider, using cracks and protrusions that were invisible to the casual observer. Williams provided overwatch from a position 200 yards away, his sniper scope sweeping the compound for guards who might spot Johnson's approach. Through his radio, he provided a running commentary on enemy movements that allowed Johnson to time his climb to avoid detection. "Guard patrol moving past the main gate," Williams reported. "2 guards on the eastern rampart. But they're looking outward, not down." Johnson reached the base of the guard tower and began placing his charges with the methodical precision that had earned him his reputation. Each explosive device was positioned to achieve maximum structural damage while minimizing the noise that would alert other defenders. He had calculated the blast effects down to the gram, ensuring that the tower would collapse inward rather than showering debris across the compound. "Charges set," Johnson reported as he began his descent. "Ready for detonation on your command." Sarah waited until Johnson had cleared the blast radius before giving the signal. The explosion was surprisingly quiet, more of a deep rumble than the sharp crack she had expected. The guard tower seemed to fold in on itself, its stone walls collapsing with a grinding sound that was muffled by the surrounding mountains. The demolition had the desired effect, creating chaos among the defenders while opening the approach route that Sarah's team needed. Guards rushed toward the collapsed tower, their attention focused on the wrong area, while the assault team prepared to exploit the confusion. "Phase 2, Sarah commanded, moving to assault positions. The team advanced through the ravine toward the compound's main wall, using the cover provided by Johnson's demolition work. Sarah could see guards running along the ramparts, their voices raised in alarm as they tried to understand what had happened to their defensive position. The main assault required Sarah to lead her team through a breach in the compound's outer wall that Johnson had identified during his reconnaissance. The opening was narrow and defended by a single guard, but it was their best option for gaining entry without triggering a full-scale alarm. Williams took out the guard with a single shot from his suppressed rifle, the sound barely audible above the wind that swept down from the surrounding peaks. Sarah led her team through the breach, immediately moving toward their primary objective in the compound's central building. The interior of the compound was a maze of stone corridors and chambers carved directly into the mountainside. Sarah had memorized the floor plan during their mission briefing, but navigating the actual structure was more challenging than she had anticipated. The corridors were narrow and confining, making movement difficult while carrying their heavy equipment. Multiple guards ahead, Patterson reported from his position at the rear of the formation. "Sounds like they're organizing a response to our breach." Sarah made a quick decision that demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had made her an effective leader. Instead of trying to avoid the guards, she decided to eliminate them before they could organize an effective defense of the central building. Tank, I need a distraction. Something that will draw their attention away from our approach route. Johnson's response was immediate. He placed a small explosive charge in a storage room 50 yards from their position, setting the timer for 30 seconds. When the device detonated, it created a fire that sent guards running in the wrong direction, while Sarah's team moved toward their objective. The central building was exactly as the intelligence reports had described it, a 3-story structure built around a natural cave system that extended deep into the mountain. Sarah knew that Hassan al-Malik was somewhere in this building, probably in the lower levels where he would feel most secure. Frost, hold this position. Don't let anyone get behind us, Sarah ordered as she prepared to lead the assault into the building. Williams took up a defensive position that would allow him to cover their retreat while also preventing enemy reinforcements from surrounding them. His sniper rifle gave him the range to engage targets throughout the compound, making him a one-man defensive line. Sarah led Johnson and Patterson into the building, their weapons ready for close-quarters combat. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps, creating shadows that could hide defenders or provide concealment for the assault team. Every doorway was a potential ambush site, every corner a place where an enemy could be waiting. They cleared the first floor methodically, using techniques they had practiced hundreds of times during their training. Sarah took point, while Johnson covered the right side, and Patterson watched their rear. They moved with the synchronized precision of dancers, each team member anticipating the other's movements and maintaining overlapping fields of fire. The second floor yielded intelligence materials that confirmed they had found the right building. Documents scattered across al-Malik's office showed financial records linking him to terrorist operations across 3 continents. Patterson gathered the materials while Sarah and Johnson continued their search for the primary target. They found Hassan al-Malik on the 3rd floor, in a room that served as both office and sleeping quarters. The terrorist financier was exactly as his photographs had depicted him, a small, nervous man who looked more like an accountant than an international criminal. But Sarah knew that this unassuming individual was responsible for funding operations that had killed hundreds of innocent people. Hassan al-Malik, you're under arrest by the authority of the United States government, Sarah announced, her weapon trained on the man who had been their objective for so many months. Al-Malik's response surprised her. Instead of surrender or defiance, he began to laugh, a sound that was somehow more chilling than any threat could have been. You fools, he said in accented English. You think you have won something? You have walked into a trap that will destroy you and everything you represent. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but she couldn't identify what it was. Her tactical instincts were screaming at her to get out of the building immediately. That's when Patterson's voice crackled through her earpiece with information that changed everything. Phoenix, I'm intercepting radio traffic from multiple sources. Looks like there are Taliban forces moving toward this position from 3 different directions. They're not here to rescue al-Malik. They're here to kill everyone in this compound, including us. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. They hadn't just walked into al-Malik's fortress. They had walked into the middle of a Taliban operation to eliminate their target before he could be captured by American forces. The terrorist organization was willing to sacrifice the compound and everyone in it to prevent al-Malik from being taken alive. How long until they reach us? Sarah asked, her mind already working through their limited options. 20 minutes, maybe less. And, Phoenix, there's something else. They're jamming all communications frequencies. I can't reach our extraction team. Sarah looked at al-Malik, who was still smiling despite being held at gunpoint. The terrorist had known this was coming. He had probably arranged it himself as a final insurance policy against capture. Even if it meant his own death, he would ensure that any American forces who came for him would die as well. Tank, we need to go. Now. Sarah grabbed al-Malik by the arm and began moving toward the exit, but Johnson's voice stopped her. Phoenix, we've got a problem. Frost reports multiple hostiles moving into the compound from the main gate. We're cut off from our extraction route. Sarah felt the walls closing in around them. They were trapped in a building that was about to be surrounded by Taliban forces, with no way to communicate with their extraction team, and no clear escape route. It was exactly the type of scenario that Admiral Watson had warned them about, the situation where no cavalry was coming to rescue them. But Sarah hadn't survived SEAL training and earned her place on the deep strike team by giving up when things got difficult. She had one advantage that the Taliban forces didn't know about. She was a pilot as well as a SEAL, and pilots were trained to think in 3 dimensions. "Ghost, how good are those demolition charges that Tank brought along?" she asked, an idea forming in her mind that was either brilliant or completely insane. "Why do you ask?" Patterson replied, though his tone suggested he already suspected what she was thinking. "Because I think it's time we made our own exit." Sarah's plan was audacious even by special operations standards. Instead of trying to fight their way out of the compound through Taliban forces, they would use Johnson's remaining demolition charges to blast their way into the cave system that extended beneath the building. The caves would provide concealment from enemy forces while they made their way to an extraction point that the Taliban couldn't anticipate. "Tank, can you bring down the back wall of this building without collapsing the entire structure on top of us?" Sarah asked. Johnson studied the wall construction with an expert's eye, calculating blast effects and structural weaknesses. "Yeah, I can do it. But once we're in those caves, we'll be traveling blind. No maps, no GPS, no way to know where the tunnels lead. Better than staying here and fighting 100 Taliban fighters," Sarah replied. "Make it happen." Johnson placed his charges with the same precision he had used throughout the mission, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. They were about to commit themselves to a course of action with no backup plan and no guarantee of success. "Everyone get behind cover," Johnson warned as he prepared to detonate the charges. "This is going to be a big one." The explosion was tremendous, the blast wave shaking the entire building and sending clouds of dust and debris throughout the corridors. When the smoke cleared, Johnson's demolition work had created a gaping hole in the building's rear wall that opened directly into the cave system beyond. "Move, move, move," Sarah shouted, pushing Al-Malik toward the opening while her teammates provided covering fire. They could hear Taliban voices getting closer, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the compound as the assault began in earnest. Williams was the last to reach the cave entrance, his sniper rifle providing covering fire until the final moment. "Multiple hostiles in the compound," he reported as he dove through the opening. "They're sweeping the building room by room." Sarah led her team into the darkness of the cave system, their flashlights providing the only illumination in the underground maze. Behind them, they could hear the Taliban forces discovering the hole in the building's wall and beginning their pursuit. The caves were everything Sarah had feared they would be. Narrow passages that forced them to move in single file, chambers that opened into multiple tunnels with no indication of which route to take, and underground streams that soaked their equipment and made every step treacherous. But the caves also provided something they desperately needed: time. The Taliban forces were reluctant to follow them into the underground maze, preferring to set up defensive positions at the cave entrances and wait for the Americans to emerge. "How far do these tunnels extend?" Patterson asked as they paused to rest in a large chamber that offered multiple exit routes. Sarah consulted the topographical maps she carried, trying to correlate their underground position with the surface features. If these caves follow the mountain's natural structure, they should extend for several miles. "We might be able to come out behind the Taliban positions." It was a slim hope, but it was better than no hope at all. Sarah made the decision to push deeper into the cave system, gambling that they could find an exit that would allow them to escape the Taliban trap. The journey through the caves tested every aspect of their training and endurance. They moved for hours through passages that seemed designed to test human limitations, climbing over rock formations and crawling through openings that barely accommodated their equipment. Al-Malik proved to be more resilient than his appearance suggested, keeping pace with the SEAL team despite his age and obvious fear. Sarah suspected that his survival instincts were more highly developed than his outer appearance suggested, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving in the world of international terrorism. After 6 hours of underground travel, Patterson's communications equipment finally picked up a weak signal from their extraction team. The rescue helicopters were searching for them, but the complex terrain made it impossible to pinpoint their location. "Can you guide them to us?" Sarah asked, hope beginning to build despite their desperate situation. Patterson worked with his equipment, trying to establish a strong enough signal to coordinate with the rescue aircraft. Maybe, but we need to get closer to the surface. These rock walls are blocking most of our transmission. Sarah made another command decision that demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had made her an effective leader. Instead of continuing their underground journey, they would risk exposure by moving to higher ground where Patterson could establish communications. They found a cave opening that led to a narrow ledge on the mountainside, nearly a mile from the compound where their mission had begun. From their vantage point, they could see Taliban fighters still searching the area around the building, unaware that their quarry had escaped through the underground passages. Patterson's communications equipment worked perfectly from their new position, and within minutes, he had established contact with their extraction team. But the news wasn't good. "Phoenix, this is Anvil 6. We've been monitoring Taliban radio traffic. They've got surface-to-air missiles positioned throughout the valley. We can't risk a direct pickup at your location." The plan that Sarah proposed to her trap team was so audacious that even Johnson, who specialized in controlled explosions, thought it bordered on insane. She intended to hijack one of the Taliban's own helicopters and fly the team to safety, using her pilot skills to turn their enemies' assets against them. "Phoenix, there's a Taliban helicopter base about 10 miles south of our current position," Patterson reported after intercepting enemy radio communications. "Intelligence reports show they have at least 2 Russian Mi-8 helicopters operational, plus ground support equipment." Sarah studied the terrain between their cave hideout and the enemy helicopter base through her binoculars. The route would require them to traverse some of the most dangerous ground they had encountered, including an open valley where they would be exposed to enemy observation for nearly 2 miles. "How many guards at the helicopter base?" Sarah asked, her tactical mind already working through the challenges of conducting an assault with only 4 operators against an unknown number of defenders. Williams, who had been monitoring the base through his sniper scope, provided the intelligence they needed. "I count at least 12 guards visible from this position, probably more inside the buildings. The helicopters are parked in a fortified compound with machine gun nests covering all approaches." Al-Malik, who had been listening to their planning with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "You are all insane. You cannot possibly succeed against such odds. Surrender now, and perhaps they will show mercy." Sarah looked at the terrorist financier with cold eyes. "The only reason you're still alive is because we need you as a witness to your own war crimes. Don't give me a reason to change that calculation." The truth was that Sarah had no intention of abandoning their prisoner, despite the tactical disadvantage he represented. The intelligence he could provide about terrorist financing networks was too valuable to sacrifice, even if keeping him alive made their escape exponentially more difficult. Johnson spread out his remaining demolition charges, calculating what would be needed to neutralize the helicopter base's defenses. "I can take out the machine gun positions, but we'll need to move fast once the fireworks start. These charges won't give us much time before every Taliban fighter in the valley shows up." The assault plan they developed was a masterpiece of tactical coordination that utilized each team member's specialized skills. Williams would provide sniper support from an overwatch position, eliminating guards and creating confusion among the defenders. Johnson would use his demolitions expertise to breach the compound's perimeter and neutralize heavy weapons positions. Patterson would maintain communications and coordinate their movements while also serving as Sarah's co-pilot once they secured a helicopter. Sarah would lead the assault team into the compound, secure one of the helicopters, and prepare it for immediate takeoff. The entire operation would need to be completed in less than 20 minutes, from initial assault to wheels up, or they would find themselves surrounded by reinforcements that would make escape impossible. They moved out at midnight, using the darkness to mask their approach to the helicopter base. The 10-mile journey took them 4 hours, as they had to avoid Taliban patrols that were still searching for them throughout the valley. Sarah set a pace that pushed her team to their physical limits while ensuring they would arrive at the target with enough energy remaining for the assault. The helicopter base was exactly as intelligence had described it, a small compound built around a natural clearing that provided landing space for the aircraft. 2 Russian Mi-8 transport helicopters sat on the improvised landing pad, their rotors tied down but otherwise ready for flight. Sarah could see that the aircraft appeared to be well maintained, suggesting that the Taliban had skilled mechanics among their ranks. Williams took up his sniper position on a ridge overlooking the compound, his rifle scope providing detailed surveillance of the target area. "I count 14 guards now," he reported quietly. 2 on each machine gun position, plus roving patrols around the perimeter. Johnson began placing his demolition charges around the compound's defensive positions, moving through the darkness with the stealth that had made him one of the Navy's premier special operations warriors. Each charge was positioned to neutralize specific threats while creating maximum confusion among the defenders. Sarah checked her watch and saw that they were running ahead of schedule, a rare advantage in special operations that she intended to exploit. "All teams report ready status." "Frost is in position," Williams confirmed. "Tank is ready to light the candles," Johnson reported. "Ghost is standing by," Patterson added. Sarah took a deep breath and gave the signal that would commit them to a course of action from which there could be no retreat. "Execute, execute, execute." The assault began with Johnson's demolitions creating a ring of fire around the compound's perimeter. The explosions were precisely timed to eliminate the machine gun positions while creating breaches in the defensive wire that surrounded the helicopter base. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder, announcing to every hostile force within 50 miles that the Americans were still operational and fighting. Williams' sniper fire began immediately after the explosions, his precise shots eliminating guards who survived the initial blast. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from his position as he engaged targets with the methodical precision that had made him a legend in the special operations community. Sarah led the assault through the breach created by Johnson's explosives, her team moving with the coordinated precision of a machine designed for violence. They advanced through the compound's defenses like a spearhead, eliminating resistance with overwhelming firepower while moving toward their objective. The Taliban defenders were caught completely off guard by the assault. They had been expecting the Americans to try to escape through the mountains, not conduct an offensive operation against one of their own bases. Their response was confused and uncoordinated, allowing Sarah's team to penetrate deep into the compound before organized resistance could be mounted. Sarah reached the first helicopter and immediately began her pre-flight inspection, her pilot training taking over despite the chaos around her. The Russian Mi-8 was unfamiliar to her, but the basic principles of rotary-wing aircraft were universal. She could see that the helicopter was fueled and ready for flight, with only the rotor tie-downs and engine startup procedures standing between them and escape. "Tank, I need you to clear the rotor disc," Sarah called out as she began the engine startup sequence. Johnson's demolitions expertise was needed to eliminate Taliban fighters who were trying to establish defensive positions around the helicopter. The Mi-8's engines came to life with a distinctive Russian roar that was different from the American helicopters Sarah was accustomed to flying. But the basic flight controls were similar enough that she could adapt quickly, her hands finding the collective, cyclic, and anti-torque pedals by muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of flight time. Patterson climbed into the co-pilot's seat, his communications equipment allowing him to coordinate with Williams and Johnson while they completed the assault on the compound. "Frost reports multiple vehicles approaching from the east," he announced. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before this place is overrun." Sarah increased the power to the rotors, feeling the helicopter begin to develop lift as the massive blades bit into the thin mountain air. The Mi-8 was heavier and less responsive than the aircraft she was used to flying, but it would get them out of immediate danger if she could get it airborne before the Taliban reinforcements arrived. Williams' voice crackled through the radio as he provided updates on the tactical situation. "Multiple technical vehicles, at least 30 fighters. They're setting up a perimeter around the compound." Johnson finished clearing the landing zone and sprinted toward the helicopter, carrying Al-Malik over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The terrorist financier had been stunned by an explosion and was offering no resistance, though Sarah suspected he was more alert than he appeared. "All aboard," Johnson shouted as he threw Al-Malik into the helicopter's cargo compartment and climbed in behind him. Williams was the last to reach the aircraft, his sniper rifle providing covering fire until the final moment. "Go, go, go," he shouted as he dove through the helicopter's door. Sarah pulled pitch and felt the Mi 8 lift off the ground, its engine straining against the weight of equipment and personnel. The helicopter was overloaded by any reasonable standard, but Sarah had learned during her SEAL training that reasonable standards didn't apply when your life depended on making the impossible work. The Taliban fighters opened fire as soon as they realized what was happening, their automatic weapons filling the air with bullets that sparked off the helicopter's armor plating. Sarah banked the aircraft hard to the right, using the compound's buildings to mask their escape route while gaining altitude as quickly as possible. Taking fire from multiple directions, Patterson reported as bullet holes appeared in the helicopter's windscreen. Engine temperatures are climbing. Sarah pushed the overloaded helicopter. Sarah felt her heart sink. They had escaped the immediate trap, but they were still stranded in hostile territory with limited supplies and no clear way home. The mission was beginning to look like the disaster that Admiral Watson had warned them about. But as Sarah studied the terrain around their position, she began to formulate another plan. It was risky, requiring skills that went beyond normal SEAL training, but it might be their only chance to get home alive. Anvil 6, what's the status of the extraction aircraft? Are they still operational? Affirmative, Phoenix. 2 Black Hawks standing by at safe distance. Why do you ask? Sarah's answer would have surprised anyone who didn't know about her pilot qualifications. Because I think it's time for me to remember how to fly. The complex timing required to make the plan work. I can maintain communications throughout the assault and coordinate our extraction once we've secured the target. Sarah looked at her teammates, seeing the same determination in their faces that had carried them through months of training and preparation. They understood the risks, but they also understood that this was exactly the type of mission they had been created to handle. All right, team. This is what we trained for. Let's go show them that Navy SEALs don't need wings to fly. The assault on Hassan al-Malik's fortress was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover that sometimes the most important victories are won not by the weapons you carry, but by the courage you find when everything seems impossible. Now that we won't let you down, this team is ready for whatever we might face. Admiral Watson studied Sarah with eyes that had seen too many young officers go off to war with confidence that would be tested by harsh reality. Sarah, confidence is important. But in special operations, survival often depends on knowing when to be afraid. Don't let your success in training make you overconfident about what you'll face in the real world. The warning would prove to be prophetic in ways that Sarah couldn't imagine as she prepared for a mission that would test everything she thought she knew about warfare, survival, and the true meaning of never leaving a teammate behind. And standing in a clearing 200 yards from the crash site was Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, calmly waving at the approaching rescue helicopters with an enemy rifle slung across her shoulder and a look of grim satisfaction on her dirt-streaked face. The rescue operation proceeded smoothly after that, the enemy having lost both their numerical advantage and their confidence. As Sarah climbed aboard the rescue helicopter, Chen caught her arm and looked into her eyes with new understanding. "SEAL?" he asked quietly, the single word carrying volumes of meaning. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Sometimes, as the helicopter lifted off from the mountainside, carrying the survivors to safety, Jake stared at his pilot with newfound respect and a dozen unanswered questions. He had thought he knew Sarah Martinez, but tonight had revealed depths to her character and abilities that he had never suspected. The official report would list the incident as a successful combat search and rescue operation, with minimal details about the specific tactics employed. But in the classified debriefings that followed, Sarah's actions that night would be studied and analyzed by special operations planners for years to come. She had proven something that night on that remote mountainside in Afghanistan. She had shown that Navy SEALs don't need wings to fly, and that sometimes the most dangerous person on a battlefield is the one the enemy never sees coming.